Okay, I think it's 11:30. We'll get started here. This is 50 tips in 50 minutes for GlassFish users. We'll do a quick introduction of myself and Arun, and then we'll jump into the 50 tips in 50 minutes. And then if we have time left over, and hopefully we will, we'll do a little QA. We'll ask that you hold your questions to the very end because, as we said in the summary for this presentation, it's a very fast-paced presentation. We're trying to cover a tip every minute, so we'll be moving through things pretty quickly. But at the end, hopefully, we'll have some time and we'll do some Q&A. So first, a little about me. My name is Chris Casso. I work on the GlassFish project. I've been working on it for about 2 years now. I mostly work in the admin infrastructure area. And today, I'm joined with Arun Gupta, who I think many of you probably know, but feel free to say anything you like.
Yeah, hi. My name is Arun Gupta. I've been with the GlassFish team pretty much since its beginning. I'm also known as the GlassFish guy. So I guess we'll talk about GlassFish tips.
So GlassFish, I guess by a raise of hands, how many people are using GlassFish now or are familiar with GlassFish? Which is good, okay, because this is not an introduction to GlassFish. We kind of just want to cover things that maybe you've not known about GlassFish. But anyway, just in case, GlassFish is the Java reference implementation. It's freely available. If you want to know more, go to glassfish.java.net. So the goals today, as I mentioned, this is going to be a fairly fast-paced presentation. We're going to cover a wide range of topics. We're prioritizing the quantity without going too deep because we just don't have time to go deep. Hopefully, this will introduce things that you didn't know before, and then afterwards you can do a little more research if you're interested in that or you want to know how to really use that. In the end, we kind of want you to say, oh, I didn't know I could do that with some of these. Probably the more seasoned user you are, probably less likely or more likely you may already be aware of the tip, though. This presentation should be a good reference for you, but we also created a wiki. So for each of the tips that we have today that we're presenting, if you go to that wiki, we have a link that will take you to more information about that tip. Sometimes it takes you to the documentation, sometimes it takes you to blogs or what have you, where we gather information. We'll also make this presentation available on that wiki as well, so that will be there too. So with that, we will get started with the first tip. So, as probably most of you know, if you're going to access the DAS, which is the Domain Administration Server remotely, you need to authenticate to it. And if you do that often, you have to provide a username and password. What many don't know is we also provide a login command. And so you can, when you use asadmin, you can use the login command to authenticate to that server, and those credentials are maintained for you. And such that subsequent commands will re-authenticate without you having to provide that information. What you may not also know is you can use login multiple times to different DASs. So if you have multiple DASs on the same system on different ports, or there are different systems altogether, you can use login multiple times. It will maintain those credentials for all of those, such that if you subsequently execute commands against that DAS, you will not be prompted. So here's an example of using the asadmin login command, where it prompts you for the username and password. It gives you a little warning because we're going to store that information in a file, so that file needs to be secured. But then subsequent execution of commands won't be prompted for any authentication. So that's useful for speeding things up. Next one I want to touch on is multimode. And this is great for batch processing. So for example, if you have a bunch of commands that you'd like to send to the server and you do this often, for example, in this case, it's creating a cluster and the instances that go with the cluster. Or maybe you have a bunch of applications you routinely have to redeploy to the server. You can use multimode, which is very useful. In this case, what I've done is I've taken those commands and I put them in a file. And then when I run the command, I give it that file name, and the subcommand is called multimode. In this case, it's going to execute all those commands for you. So very easy if you routinely have to repeat the same commands over and over again, throw them in a file and you're good to go. You can also pipe commands into asadmin as well. So folks may not be aware of that. So in this case, if you're running asadmin in a script, you can put it in a for loop, and in this case, we're creating 5 local instances by piping that into asadmin. So another way to kind of speed up, if you have a lot of routine tasks that you have to do. Then we have a couple environment variables I wanted to touch on. There's a debug environment variable, and this is great if you run into problems with the client trying to execute a command against the DAS. Something going on, you want to try to get some more details. You can look in the server logs, but this actually allows you to see kind of what's going on the client side as well. So you set ASDebug to true, you execute the command, and what you'll see is some of the command processing information. You'll see the URL that we're actually using when we interact with the DAS, and then the raw response we get back from the server is there as well. And it looks something like this. I kind of cleaned it up and reduced it just to fit on this one slide. There's more information that you'd normally see. But here I set ASDebug to true. I'm running the uptime command here. And in this case, we're getting the raw response back. This is the string that you would normally see in the output, but you also see it sends back the value in milliseconds and a few other things that are there. And this, of course, varies from command to command in terms of what you see. The uptime command is pretty simple. And then we also have the aslog environment variable, which is useful too. If you run a lot of commands and you want to go back and view kind of how did they succeed or not, or if you want to see, if you have other administrators using the system and you want to see what commands they have run, and you have the aslog environment, if everybody sets the aslog environment variable to the same place, you can go back and see what commands have been executed and what the exit status were of those commands. We use this a lot in our tests. So we have test suites that run thousands and thousands of commands, and if we come across a problem, we want to figure out, okay, well, which command triggered the problem? We can go back and look at this log file and see where maybe the exit code started returning 1 instead of 0, to tell them that's where the problem started. So this is useful as well for kind of debugging issues. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Arun for the next 5.
That was pretty fast, actually. We are a minute early. We were planning of having some fun here, switching the tips every minute or so. But we thought that's too much, for us and for the audience as well. We'll give you 5 tips in a sequence, so 5 him, 5 me. We're going to take turns that way. Anyway, so 95% of you pretty much are using GlassFish today. Yes, we have nightly builds, promoted builds, all of those available for you. We have continuous integration that is available to you. But some of you want more cutting edge than that. So for people like you, we have check out the workspace and build yourself. Where you want to debug the code, where you want to play around with it. I'm using GlassFish version 3.1, and there's a particular bug I'm facing over there. I want to attach my debugger to the entire GlassFish code base. How many of you have done that? Yeah, see, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, there are 10 hands in the room which have actually attached your code to GlassFish code base. So this would tell you exactly how you can check out the workspace. So it's a simple SVN checkout. Trunk is where we do the version on the latest edition of Java EE. So Java EE 7, this is where we're working on. We just need to set up Maven OPTS and CD GlassFish and Maven, and that's it. So that'll build, the entire GlassFish install, in a separate zip file that'll be available to you. Took about 5 minutes on my machine. If you probably build for the very first time on a brand new machine, it'll download the entire internet on your machine using Maven. So it may take a little longer, but if you have the internet on your machine, this would take about this much time. You do need JDK 16U22 plus because there are some issues for the releases before that in order to build it. And if you are building trunk, then you need Maven 303 plus. And if you're building 3.x or any previous releases, then you can do a Maven 221 as well. Now, if you want to check out a specific tag, now when we release, we make sure we tag it appropriately. So if you want to check out 311 or 312, then look at the last command. Then instead of saying SVN checkout, which is the trunk, you could say SVN checkout. You can give that URL at the bottom of the screen, and it'll check out that specific version. Installers. Well, we built the workspace. We're done with that. Now I want to use something that is ready-made. So there are 3 flavors of installers that we have. There's a zip. How many of you use zip today? Okay, yeah, I use zip myself all the time. Simple, download it, unzip it, and ready to roll. You could also, there's a GUI installer as well. There's 3 different flavors of GUI. You could have on a Windows. You could have 2 flavors, 3 actually. So there's a Windows flavor. There's a Linux, Unix, Mac flavor, and there is a AIX flavor. IBM is special. It's because some issues of the code portability across JDK. But the idea is you can download the GUI installer. GUI installer walks you through different steps, ports, directories, etc. Zip installer just says unzip, and it creates a top-level GlassFish 3 directory, and you run with that. And then there's a silent installer as well, which is what I like, which is what you need for your headless systems, for example. So look at the last 2 blue boxes. You can do a dry run, with a zip installer or with the shell installer. You can give the command -n, and it'll create, it'll pretend as if installing, but then it'll store all your answers in an install file separately. Then you can say, oh, by the way, use this answer file now and install it. So you can actually install it, for example, say GlassFish 3122 unix.sh, give you an answer file and do -s. It'll do a silent install on your headless machine very easily. asadmin. So you've installed it, now you want to use it. So you say asadmin. What do I do? You say asadmin, by default your help appears. Or we try to make the commands very intuitive. You say list -commands and it will list you all the command. We have local commands which can be run without the admin DAS running, or you could have remote commands with the DAS running. So you can find out what commands are available. For example, create cluster is a remote command. You cannot, or start instance, or those are kind of remote commands. You can of course configure between I want to see only local command or I want to see only remote commands by giving the switches like local only true or remote only true. That's very much possible. This is the fun part, where you say, I don't know what my command looks like. So you say asadmin start. So it will show you all the commands that have start word in them. Or create, I want to create JDBC resource. So you say create JDBC, or you just say asadmin JDBC. It'll list everything that has JDBC command in that command. By default, the secure administration is disabled because we expect you to use it for development to begin with, and then of course you can go into production. So by default, remote administration is disabled. Now, if you want to remotely administer GlassFish, so for example, GlassFish is installed on a separate machine, and you want to administer it here, so you have to enable it explicitly. So for that, first of all, you need to change the admin password. By default is empty. For remote administration, basically securing it, you have to make it non-empty. So you say asadmin change password, and then all you say is asadmin enable secure admin. It generates self-signed certificate. It's not tied to any certificate authorities, so you can't use it. But for that, you have to really go with VeriSign or one of those providers, which gives you that certificates. But this actually gets you started. Remote administration, all of that is available. And of course, you can disable it as well. Java logging and logging on Java, they say both should be avoided. Now, if you don't like Java logging, then of course you can use configure log4j for GlassFish. Very simple. Just drop your log4j.jar file in the GlassFish lib. Your properties file goes into the domains domain1 config directory. So you drop it in there, and you create your JVM options. You basically tell where your log4j properties file live. This is global. I mean, all the applications will start using log4j. But in certain cases, you may want your log4j to be effective only for a specific application, in which case you bundle it, your log4j XML file, in your webinif classes or your module jar file.
It took 36 of my seconds. Okay, password aliases. So generally you're going to configure GlassFish to use external services. We call those resources. Those resources many times need passwords. The configuration for those resources generally live in the domain.xml. So you may end up with an entry like this in your domain.xml. It actually contains the password for the external services. Many companies don't have policies that say you can't do that. You can't keep those passwords in things like the domain.xml. So we provide something called password aliases that help you work around that issue through the create password alias command. What you do is you give the name of the alias. In this case, it's dbpw alias. You enter the password for that external resource, whatever it may be. You've now created this linkage between the password alias and the actual password. And then that password is stored in the domain's encrypted key store. Okay, so it's nice and safe. You then, inside the domain.xml, instead of actually putting the password for that external resource, you actually put the alias, and the syntax looks something just like this. So you've eliminated putting the actual password in the domain.xml. That's tip number 11. Tip number 12. So suppose you need to create a cluster where the instances for this cluster are on other systems. Maybe there's 5 separate systems you need to install the cluster on. For clustering to work, you actually have to have the GlassFish software installed on those systems. One way to do it is you log in each of the systems and you install the software. We provide a command called install node that makes that fairly easy to do. And what install node does is it actually copies the current install that you're running the command from, or you can actually point it to an existing glassfish.zip file. It will copy those bits over to the host that you specify and install the product there. So potentially if you have 5 other nodes you need to install GlassFish on, you can run one command provide the list of the 5 nodes you want to install it on, and it will copy the software over there and install it, and you'll be good to go to configure your cluster. So that makes clustering setup pretty straightforward to do. I'll note that on Windows, if you have DCOM, you can use install node DCOM to do the same thing. So tip 13, our clustering is dynamic in nature, and that means that once a cluster's up, instances can come and go. They're able to talk to each other so they know kind of the shape of the cluster, and they inform each other as that shape of the cluster changes. In order to accomplish this, we use something called the Group Management Service, or GMS. And GMS depends on multicast. So for our dynamic clustering to work, you have to make sure that multicast is working properly. And so that's something you can go ask your network administrator to see how they have it set up, or we provide a command called validate multicast, which will verify that the different instances, the different nodes that are going to be within your cluster can actually see each other through multicast. And so that looks something like this. What you do is you run this asadmin validate multicast command on each of the instances where you're going to have a node in your cluster. You run those all simultaneously. They attempt to talk to each other, and as they talk to each other, they will tell you that they're talking to each other. So this is very useful in just validating that your cluster is going to work as you'd expect. Once you have your cluster up, once you have your domains up, a couple other interesting or simple tips that you might find useful. You can run list domains, and it will tell you of the domains that are known to this instance of the DAS, or sorry, this instance of the install, which ones are up and running. So that's useful. And then you can also, within a domain, check to see how long it's been running. And so this is running the uptime command here to show you which, how long a domain's been up and running. Within a cluster, you may want to see, okay, how long have the instances been running? Are all the instances up and running? So we have something called get health. And you specify the name of the cluster, and then that will return back simply which instances are up, how long, when they actually were started, or when they were actually stopped. So that will give you kind of the health of your cluster.
Cluster, 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 cluster. 2 more tips on cluster, actually. So GlassFish provides SSH-based clustering. What that means is, if you install DAS and you say, I want to install the cluster across different machines, if you have SSH provisioning working, SSH configured between 2 machines, it will automatically provision your instances, issue your commands, all those things. But we know how painful it is to set up SSH on a Windows machine. So that's why we provide SSH clustering with DCOM. So if you have DCOM configured properly on a Windows machine, which I don't know is probably less painful, but you at least has an alternative. So you could have your DAS running, for example, on a Windows box, and you have your different instances on a Windows box. So your administrator has given right privileges for DCOM. The first command that we recommend is set up local DCOM. So it allows, it configures DCOM, checks, what permissions are required, and it tells you what's important and what's to be careful about. Then you validate DCOM. This basically provides a sanity check for DCOM required for GlassFish. Running this command ensures, gives you some peaceful satisfaction that the other commands would succeed. If this command does not run, that means other commands will not run for sure. And then from there onward, you can start creating your create node, install, delete node, uninstall, all those, they have their DCOM version of the command, for example. All you do is -DCOM at the end of it. All of this, of course, integrated in admin console. So validate DCOM, all of those things automatically trigger if you have that setup running on Windows box. Last one on clusters. So SSH is good, DCOM is good. You don't want to deal with any of that. So we allow you to do clusters without SSH as well. A little bit more manual work, but you do need JDK U6, JDK 1.6, U24 plus, because there's some security issues in versions prior to that. But effectively, you start up your DAS, you enable secure administration, so self-sign certificate, all that thing kicks in automatically. You create cluster. At this point, it's still a local command. All you're saying is I'm creating a cluster. Then on each instance, of each remote machine, you explicitly specify what the host is, then you create a local instance. And then you start verifying on the DAS. List my clusters, list my instances, list my nodes. So instead of SSH-based provisioning, you're doing sort of sneak connectivity, between these machines, running around these machines. You may not want to deal with the SSH, but at least there's a workaround. And then you start your instances, local instances. Now, you may want something that should trigger, like when your application server is starting up, or there are lifecycle callback events, for application server wide. So lifecycle listener, this is the interface that exactly provides you that. So in glassfish-api.jar, we have this interface, concern app server lifecycle listener. Just one method, handle event, gives you lifecycle events. Within that, you can do a switch on the le.get event type. And as you can see, it gives you init event, ready event, shutdown event, startup event, and one of them is repeat, actually, so not a good loop. Anyway, so you get the point. So there are different events over there on which you can act upon it. And this is application server wide. Now in GlassFish, we also provide application versioning. What that means is you can have multiple versions of an application deployed to the application server, only one of them being enabled. So this really allows you to simplify your upgrade process and rollback process. So let's say you have a RC1, you can deploy RC1, RC2, and RC2 you find a bug, you can just roll back to RC1. So the way it works is, if you took a look at an example, it says asadmin deploy, you give it an additional -- name command. By default, enable is true, so whatever version you deploy is the latest one. Or you can specify enable false. I'm deploying RC1, but I'm not enabling it. Then you can enable it explicitly. And then let's say your final version is released, you want to undeploy all those previous versions. You can say asadmin undeploy, and you can give sort of a regular expression to undeploy all those versions altogether. Something on the similar lines, we also have called as application scoped resources. What they give you is, if you have global resources, let's say you have a JDBC connection pool, you have 3 JDBC resources created from that, and they're all trying to access the application. How do you confine, how do you make sure that you have a set number of connections available to you? You can't, unless you create a dedicated connection pool for a resource, so that mapping has to be that way. So application scope resources actually frees up you from resource starvation. You define these resources, not just JDBC, but JMS, Java Mail, all these resources could be defined as part of application itself. And then, basically you define them in glassfish-resources.xml in webinf. And then these resources are available only to the application. They're not accessible outside the application or the module or whatever the scope is. They're automatically created and deleted as part of application deployment and undeployment process.
Back on schedule. Okay, how to start GlassFish as a service. So suppose you need to integrate GlassFish with the operating system's native service support. So it's booted. So when the system boots, the GlassFish service, either the DAS or the instances are actually started as well. So to make that easy, we provide a command called create service. It works on Windows, it works on Linux, it works on Solaris. And essentially it integrates with the native service infrastructure for whatever operating system you target. Some key things about this: it must be executed as super users root in order to integrate with the service. We have a dry run option, which makes it easy to see what it's going to do before it actually does anything on the operating system. And we also have what says delete server here, but it's actually a delete service command that it's undocumented that can attempt to reverse things. So to run the command, it looks something like this. So this is actually on Solaris, where I run asadmin create service domain 1. And essentially it tells you what it's doing here in terms of, on Solaris it uses SMF, so there's manifest files that need to be created. So in this case it creates the appropriate manifest file for starting the DAS as a native service. And then at the end it tells you actually what commands you could run then to enable it or disable it once it has been integrated with the operating system. So it does something very similar on Linux as well as Windows. So this is a useful command to make it very easy to integrate with system services. Now I'm going to jump into talk about monitoring. I have a few tips around monitoring. We have very extensive monitoring built into GlassFish, and it's available through the CLI, it's available through REST, it's available through JMX. The console provides a nice UI as well for enabling monitoring. We have a monitoring tree. The shape and size of that tree varies based on which modules are loaded, whether monitoring is enabled for those modules or not. You have fairly fine-grained control over how you enable monitoring. And then when you enable monitoring, you actually have several levels. When it's turned off, there's no performance impact at all. When you enable it, you can enable it at the low level, which gives you very basic sort of count statistics around different areas, depending on what module it is. And then you can actually go into a high mode of monitoring where it actually starts measuring the amount of time it's in actual methods and reporting that kind of information back. So it's not enabled by default, but you can turn it on without restarting the server, which is nice. And if you were to run it without enabling it, the output you'd get would be something like this. So I'm using the asadmin git command with -m for monitoring, and then we use wildcarding here. So this says just return all the monitoring data you have. And if this was enabled, it would just give me a ton of data back. And since it's not enabled, you get something like this back. It just says there's nothing to report. So how do you enable it? We have an enable monitoring command that allows you to target specific modules to enable monitoring for. In this first example, I'm enabling it at a high level for the web container. And like I said, that happens dynamically. The server's already up and running, and it basically turns on monitoring at the high level on just the web container. You can target a cluster. So this is actually enabling it for the DAS, which isn't so interesting. This one here, I'm actually targeting a cluster called C1, and I'm enabling monitoring for the EJB container. Or you can actually target an instance as well. Question might come up, well, how do I know what modules I can enable monitoring on? Well, you can do something like this. It's asadmin git server.monitoring service, wildcard that, and that will list the module names and the current associated monitoring levels. You can also go to the console. The console, if you have that available, will give you these names as well. So let's take a look at how you actually see some of the data. As I mentioned, it's monitored. It's maintained in a hierarchical tree. So here's an example of I want to see the available monitoring elements without actually seeing the monitoring data. And then so a list, the key difference here between this and the next slide you'll see is I'm using list here and wildcarding that. And so this just shows me these are parts of the tree, kind of nodes in the tree that has some monitoring data associated with it. So that's how you get the list. And then if you actually want to view the data, then you actually use the git subcommand. And I said earlier, this would just dump out everything. It's fun to do, to see what's there if you've enabled monitoring for everything. But I can't show that here on the slide. So let's ask some specific questions. For example, let's find out who implemented the JVM the server's running on. So in this case, I'd do server.jvm runtime, VM vendor current. I don't know why it's current, but I think that's correct though. It's not a typo, and it returns back that Apple actually implemented this the JVM the server's running on. I think there's a few more examples here I can show you. If we want to find out currently how much heap is being used by the server, so I'd give it a monitoring element that looks something like this, and it returns back the heap being used. And then the other one here is for a specific deployed application, I can actually include the application name as part of this hierarchical name, and we can find out how many active sessions are associated with that web app. So that is how you kind of get kind of per instance monitoring data. But suppose you want to monitor a particular thing, and see how it changes over time. Kind of how netstat works, if you're familiar with netstat. Well, we have another command called asadmin monitor. You give it an interval and the type of thing you want to monitor, and then it will, using that interval, display constantly, kind of update on an updating based on the interval information that's being monitored. In this case, it's the JVM heap information. We can also do like the web module as well. And you'll get a bunch of headers here and you go, well, what do these all mean? Well, you can use asadmin help, and that will actually show them to you as well. But anytime while this is running, you can hit H, and it will show you what the headers are as well. So that's a easy way to convert, what's RST and what does that mean. I don't have time to cover here, but we also support JavaScript, integrate JavaScript into monitoring as well. There's a run script command. So if you're interested in using JavaScript to monitor GlassFish as well, you can do some research on that, and you'll find some good blogs and examples out there. And then JMX. So if you ever looked at the server log file, you might have seen kind of this odd message appearing in there. And essentially, this is providing you the address if you wanted to use a JMX-based client, such as JConsole or JVisual VM, to attach to the server and interact with it over JMX. And this works both for the DAS and the instances. So you copy that address into your JMX-friendly client, and then you connect to the server. And in this case, we're looking at the heap usage. But you can also click on this, and you'd see all the MBeans all the monitoring beans that are associated with GlassFish, and you can kind of walk the tree there. So this is another way to sort of visually monitor GlassFish using JMX.
All right, midway. It would be fun to keep a count of how many tips you really learned or were old or new. It'd be good to see a tweet around that. I learned 4 tips from this 50 tips. That will be good feedback for us. Anyway, tip 26. So GlassFish supports OSGi applications, in the sense that you can take a OSGi bundle, raw OSGi bundle not related to Java EE, dump it as is. That will work because GlassFish runs on Felix, uses Felix as a OSGi runtime. Or you can also build a OSGi hybrid application, which is using Java EE technologies and OSGi together, publishing an EJB as an OSGi endpoint, or invoking a JAX-WS web service in an OSGi bundle. All of those combinations are possible. The code sample at the bottom shows how you could say, for example, somebody is running an OSGi endpoint. You want to just invoke that service in your Java EE application running in GlassFish. All you say is @inject @OSGi service. This is a CDI portable extension that we have built, and you say dynamic true. By default, it's not true, but you make it dynamic true. So every time the service goes up and down, the proxy behind the actual the endpoint behind the proxy is automatically adjusted accordingly. So you can dynamically invoke a OSGi service in a Java EE application using this CDI portable extension. Now, you have deployed your OSGi bundles or your hybrid applications. How do you debug those services, running in GlassFish? Well, as I said, we are using Felix as a default runtime. So you can enable Apache Felix Gogo, which is a default shell that is available for you. By default, again, it's not enabled, so you have to enable it explicitly. There is a GlassFish config OSGi.properties file. You just change the level from here to 3. Or you can also create a JVM option, by this way. So both ways work. But once you've enabled it, then you can say telnet localhost 6666. Once you connect it, then again you see, okay, show me what commands are available. You can list all the bundles that are available to you. For example, LB would show you the list of bundles. Once you see the list of bundles, then you can say, give me more details about this bundle. Or you can install a bundle from a jar file. You can uninstall a bundle. You can you can update a bundle, you can inspect a bundle. There are a lot more details available around it. Now, GlassFish comes with OSGi runtime already, which is Felix. But you can also run GlassFish in another OSGi shell. So for example, you have a OSGi runtime running in your environment and you want to run GlassFish in there. So a couple of options to do that. Well, of course, you get the bundle context somehow from framework util. Once you get the bundle context, then you can say install my glassfish.jar. Whatever your location of your glassfish.jar is, then you can start the bundle. They'll automatically start up GlassFish for you. And in between, you do your processing, and effectively, you can do the bundle stop. Now, glassfish.jar also has a bundle activator from which the location of GlassFish and the directory domain, all of those are automatically reduced. The other part is, if you are running more like, a Nopplerfish or some other console or some other OSGi shell, then you can start up your OSGi shell, install the bundle there explicitly, giving it the location of the jar file, and then start the bundle. So, start your OSGi shell, install the bundle, start the bundle. I think this is a very powerful tip. Most of the questions, well, not most of the questions, but one of the big questions that we get asked on the forum is, my server is hanged, what do I do? Well, this is what you do. This is how you troubleshoot your JVM. We want you to send us a thread dump. Now, how do you get a thread dump? asadmin generate JVM report. And there are different options that are available to you. Thread, class, memory, summary is a default, or you can say just generate a log for it. It generates a really extensive report for you. There are tons of JVM command lines, part of the JDK that are available to you. These commands were lacking in the Mac JDK, but they're now available in Mac JDK as well. So for example, you could say JPS, list all the instrumented JVM. So it will give you the process number that is available for you to debug more. Once you get JPS and you get the process number, then you give JStack to it. It will give you all the Java threads running for that given process. So on and so forth. You can generate a lot of debug information. So if you are filing a bug like that, or if you are sending a report to the user forum, This kind of information is really useful. You can, of course, connect your JVisual VM to get a constant view of what is the snapshot of your GlassFish looks like. So that's also possible. And we talked about how we need to explicitly enable remote administration of GlassFish. But once you have done that, now, well, GlassFish and NetBeans, they work very well with each other. You can also configure a remote GlassFish instance in NetBeans. So if you're building your application locally and you want to deploy to that remote, I hope it's not a production application server, but if the GlassFish instance is running on a remote machine, you can very easily deploy on that. Now, regular operations work like develop, deploy, debug, but deploy on save and those kind of operations may not work. But at least you have the basic capability for that.
Okay, our REST interfaces. I can't do this justice in just a couple minutes, unfortunately, but we'll try to sort of scratch the surface here. So we do expose a nice REST interface within GlassFish. It's implemented on top of Project Jersey. There's two main resources that you can access. There's configuration and management through that first path there, and then you can also access monitoring through the second path here. As an example here, I can use curl through the management path to execute a view log command. And I give it an offset into the log, and what this will come back is the actual log offset, about 300K into the log. Nice thing about this is actually there's a header that comes back in that response called back up here. X-text append next, which gives me this URL with this updated, so that the next time I run it, it will actually be that farther down in the log. So always I can keep executing this in a loop and just kind of monitor the log, which is very nice. You can access REST interfaces through a browser. Here's a couple examples where I'm going actually looking at the cluster resources within a browser interface. If I were to click on, say, the list clusters to see what clusters exist within here, I will see that there's a C1 cluster and it's not running. So I'm basically seeing the different information about that resource. In this case, it's a cluster. Below that, or sorry, I guess I don't have it here. Below that, it has other commands that I could actually execute by clicking on those links related to the cluster. If we jump over to the monitoring side, I can actually access, just like we were doing with the CLI or through GMX, I can access the same monitoring information. In this case, we're looking at JVM heap through the monitoring resource. Now, the response format that comes back can be varied. In this case, we're getting it back as HTML for the browser, but you can actually view that as JSON or XML as well, and that's controlled simply by the suffix that you use when you access that resource. For example, if I were to access the JVM memory with .json, then it will look something like this. Actually, if you have a plugin in your browser, it will look like this. If you don't, it will just be a long string. So that's how you control the output through the suffix. Now, with the REST interface, it's more than read-only. You can actually change configuration over REST as well through that management tree. So, for example, if we had an application called Hello that had been deployed, and we wanted to change it through the REST interface, you could enter that path, and you would get something that looks something like this, and gives you all the different attributes of that particular command. These are the same things that you would normally find available on, say, the deploy command or the commands that interact with applications. They would appear here as well. But you could enter, say, a different context route. You can update it through the REST interface. Below, so on this same screen, below this, as I mentioned before, there are the commands that you can interact with in order to change a command. We can also use REST to deploy a command, to undeploy a command, and I have some examples of that here. So in this case, this does the same thing as the deploy command. And we're deploying an application called application.war. It exists at this point on my client. I'm using the post operation, and I'm posting it to this portion of the management tree. This is where applications live. This is the force equals true, says that if this application already exists, then go ahead and update it. If you look at the enable command, it has something very similar, has a force option. So that will push the command over to the server and essentially deploy it over REST. We can also undeploy it by doing a delete HTTP operation by specifying the name of the application to delete. Or if we wanted to get the version of the server, you could run a REST command similar to this. In this case, we're using git. Right? So to change something on the server, you do to push something over there, you use post. To delete, you use delete, and then if we just want to sort of read-only view, we can use git using these REST resources. Moving on to domain templates. So whenever you create a domain, the actual initial domain.xml is based on a template that we have in the templates directory. If you routinely have to create domains that have specific configuration in them, maybe say certain JVM options you want sort of to be already preset, there's no reason you can't create your own template and use that. Generally, you start by taking an existing template, copying it to a different name, modifying it however you need to. And then when you actually create the domain, you just specify your template name. And you don't have to specify the full path here. If you put your template in the template directory, then it will find it and it will use that template to create the domain. Another nice thing to note here is you can actually verify that your template that you created is syntactically correct by running verify domain XML after you've created the domain, and it will let you know if whether there was any issues with parsing that domain.xml.
Yet another question that we get asked all the time on the forums is, okay, got my application already, Java EE6 is there, where do I host my application? Well, of course, your private data center, your public data centers, all of those are options. But these are some of the providers that actually provide GlassFish hosting today. And some of them provide managed hosting, wherein they don't expose admin console to you. They do all the administration management for you. Some of them provide VPS servers, where you can say, you know what, give me my private server, and I want access to admin console. I want to play around with it. Some of them even provide PaaS hosting. JElastic, for example, provides PaaS hosting. So give yourself 5 seconds and take a look at this. These are this is a pretty extensive list. And this is only some that I could figure out by Googling it. I'm sure there are more that are available. So there's a lot of GlassFish hosting options that are available for you today. You have created your domain. You want to make sure that all the data, configuration data and the application data is regularly backed up. So there are 2 ways of doing that. First is a manual, where you explicitly back up domain. It effectively takes a zip of your domain directory and stores it in a zip file. You could restore from that zip directory back, and then you can, of course, list how many backups are available. Or the easier way, which is actually available only in Oracle GlassFish Server, commercial edition, but still available for you, available for evaluation. So you can create backup configuration. First of all, actually, you create a schedule. You can say, I want my backups to be done every day. Like every midnight, I want the backups of the config directory. And every weekend, for example, I want a backup of my entire domain directory. That means config and applications. So you can create multiple schedules, and then you can create configuration, and then play around with it. How do you want the backup to be done? And then you could also define, like, after 25 backups, kind of start rolling over. So those kind of configurations are possible. Transparent JDBC pool reconfiguration. So let's say your JDBC pool, is pointing to a particular host or a port or username or password. One of those values have changed. Now, the fact that any of those values have changed should not require you to restart an application server. So you can enable JDBC pool reconfiguration for your application. So the idea is the new requests that are in flight are served, and once they're completed, then the application is seamlessly migrated to the new JDBC connection pool properties. So it's very seamless for you. You can even define a wait timeout, make sure that all the in-flight transactions are completed, and then do a failover. Like 30 seconds, no requests are coming, for example. We have lots of logging, monitoring information available as part of GlassFish. So if you're using JPA, of course, in the persistence.xml, you can enable logging, and it starts dumping out a lot more information for you. But if you're using JDBC application, then you can actually start tracing SQL queries at a much lower layer itself. So, well, first of all, you need to set the JavaX Enterprise Resource SQL trace log level to fine, which is a default. So there's no setting over there, I'm sorry. Then you can implement an API, which is part of the GlassFish API itself. Again, this is a GlassFish specific feature. So you can implement SQL trace list. There's a typo over there. But once you implement the listener, then you can just set the listener to a specific property. You can say asadmin, there's a bunch of, that's the property name over there, and you can specify your listener. So find logging level and setting the listener. Those two things are important. And then whatever you want to dump from your listener will be dumped in the console very easily. Two more things that you can also do there is, I want to see what are my top queries. Like what are the queries executed in the last half an hour or the top queries. So you can start tagging them and they'll start getting identified. Or you can also say, I want to cache my queries, so time to keep queries in minutes. So you can start specifying them. They have a default value, or you can, of course, change them as well. Now, something else that we also provide for JDBC is the statement and connection leaks and reclaim. So take a look at the code on the left-hand side. If you have your S is your statement, C is your connection, then you are required to explicitly close them. Yes, we can close them, but we tend to forget, or we put them in some different finally loop, or it's a software, could misbehave as well. So that's where you can actually set these properties in your GlassFish domain.xml itself. You can say, I want to set my statement leak timeout in 2 seconds, statement timeout in 6 seconds, and connection leak timeout in 10 seconds. So the idea is if you just enable those 3 values, it will start printing out log messages in your server log that, oh, this leak out is happening. It's not going to do anything about it, just a log message. But you can, of course, say statement leak reclaim and connection leak reclaim true, in which case these connections and statements are automatically reclaimed back. Now, that means they're no longer being used. The metrics are being met, so they're reclaimed.
Okay, 10 to go. So GlassFish comes with a cross-platform software set of tools for updating the product from a network repository. This stuff is based on the image packaging system, which is in Solaris 11. And there's a CLI and there's a desktop or GUI tools as well. So what we have at Oracle is a bunch of repositories that are set up that are fronted by servers and load balancers and what have you. So when you interact with it through our tools, you'll get routed to one of the repositories, and then it will check and see whether there's new packages available for you to download or whether there's packages that you currently have installed that need to be updated. So one of the tools that I'll focus on here is just PKG, which you'll find in the bin directory with your GlassFish install. So PKG list will just show me the packages that are currently installed in my GlassFish installation. Those names package names may not mean much to you here, so you can do PKG list-s, and it actually gives you some reasonable names for what those packages are. There's also a PKG list-u, and this will show you those packages that currently need to be updated. That means that there are newer versions out on the repository that your install is pointing to that you could potentially update if you want to. And then to do so, you just run image update. And that one little line will go through and it will update all the packages that need to be updated for your particular install. So it makes keeping current, especially if you're using one of the developer workspaces, or one of the developer repositories, it allows you to stay very current with kind of what we're doing within Oracle. We also, when you install the product, a desktop notifier will get installed and configured. And what this does is behind the scenes, it will monitor the repositories and will let you know if any new updates have become available. I think out of the box, this is probably configured to wake up every week, but you can turn it off, obviously, or change it to a different check frequency. But you just click on this thing when it pops up, and much like any of these other updaters, it will go off and inform you what needs to be updated and allow you to choose to update if you wish. There's also a nice, more functional GUI tool that allows you to manage multiple installs of GlassFish on your system, check and see which packages are installed and what the state of those packages are, and get some additional information about what the content of that package is, what version, when it was published, things of that sort. So this is a nice tool, if you're not familiar with it, it's called Update Tool, that allows you to sort of see what's going on with your install and how it relates to what's currently in the repositories. This next one, which I can't do justice in just a minute or two, but we provide a very extensive framework for adding to GlassFish. You can add your own containers to GlassFish. You can build your own commands into GlassFish. And so this kind of focuses on how to write your own custom commands within GlassFish in just like 3 quick slides, or 3 or 4 quick slides. Really what we try to do here is make common operations in writing commands very easy to do, as you'll see for some of the code here. So that you can just focus on doing the logic. We actually have a server add-on component development guide that I recommend if you're interested in doing this. Take a look at that. It walks you through the whole process. So let's take an example. So we have an asadmin create my container command that we want to write. It wants to take has a mandatory option called originator, takes a string, optional option called description, takes a string, enabled, true or false, and then the container name. So to add a command called create my container, you create a class that implements admin command. And the key here is that it has to be have the @service annotation with the name of the command. Okay, so there's how you get your command known to the GlassFish. The implementation of this class looks something like this. For each of the parameters that you want to expose on the for the user to use, you annotate them with @param. So there's the originator, there's the description, there's the true and false one called enabled, and then finally the container name. And so each of these annotations have some options that control essentially the characteristics of this, whether it's required or optional, what values are accepted, whether it's parameter or an operand. So that's all controlled through this simple param annotation. And then your main body, where you actually do the meat of your work, is within an execute command. And you do your real work here, and then essentially set your exit code either success or failure. I think we have a warning as well that you could return. But that's how easy it is, to create a command like that in terms of managing the parameters and the execution of it. So pretty straightforward. Last one here, or two more on JVM. So one question we get often is, okay, when I start the domain, well, which JVM is being used? What's the process that GlassFish uses to decide? Well, here's the precedence that we use. So first we look at the domain.xml to see if the Java home attribute is, we see if Java home attribute is set in the Java config element. Generally that's not there unless you've added it. Next we look to see if ASJava has been set in the asenv.conf file or bat file. Generally it's not set there either unless you've added it. Now if you have the Java home environment variable set, then we'll use that. So sometimes that's there, but most often, more times than not, the JVM is decided by the asadmin command when you do start domain, because asadmin is a Java client. So it already knows where Java is, and so the Java home system properties are already set. And so that's generally what the JVM that's going to be used by the server when you start is through that. And then how do we validate these? If you set this value or we get it from here, well, essentially we're just making sure that that path is valid. And if that works out, then we're going to take it. And then if you want to modify the options to the JVM that's used when you start up the server, how's that done? Well, again, in the domain.xml, there's a Java config element that you would add to. Now, if you look in there, though, you may find you got multiple Java config elements. There's something in the default config area. There's something in the server config. There might be something called cluster1 config. Well, which one do I use? The server config is the configuration for the DAS. Okay, so if you want to modify the configuration for the DAS, you go to that one. The default config is the one that's used whenever we create a new config within the domain.xml. So, for example, you create a cluster, it needs to create a new config for it, it copies that. So if any future configs that are created you want to affect, then you'd modify that one. If you have a cluster named cluster1, then you'd find something that looks like that, and that's where you'd find the Java config element. That's one way to do it, hand editing. But we also provide some commands that makes this pretty easy to do. There's a list JVM options where you specify the target, whether it's a DAS or a cluster name or whatever, and it will show you the JVM options that are currently configured for that particular config. If you want to add to it, you can use create JVM options. If you want to remove an option, use delete JVM. Pretty straightforward to use. But if you're changing anything other than system properties, you're going to have to restart the JVM, obviously, to get them to take effect. But that's an easy way to control the JVM options for the server. Oh, and then I actually have an example of using create JVM options.
All right. Now, when you're upgrading, how many of you use the upgrade tool? One. Okay. And how many of you, when you're upgrading, how many of you delete that directory, download a new zip, and then upgrade it that way? Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. I mean, we have been getting that consistent feedback. Yeah. So, well, I don't know if I should give this tip anyway. But, well, there are two ways by which you can upgrade using upgrade tool. Using GUI, you can just fire up AS upgrade, and then it'll guide you the process, and then you can upgrade it that way, or there is a command line version as well. So in terms of command line, you can this is a side-by-side upgrade, by the way. That means you have downloaded a new directory and you want to upgrade from 311 to 312. So you can specify what your source domain and target domain is. Then it will start copying the directories. And then once you are in the target domain, then you explicitly say -- upgrade. Or you can use the update tool and package, which is in-place upgrade. So within GlassFish itself, let's say you have your domain.xml, all those configurations figured out, you don't want to touch it. So all you say is package image update, for example, the CLI version is, and then it will automatically figure out what the new packages are, and then it will download it and play around with it. Now, if you're using an open source version, and then you want to upgrade to commercial version, that's also pretty seamless. Of course, you need to buy the commercial license, but the upgrade is pretty simple. Effectively, we require you to remove the repositories where the packages are pushed. For the developer version, the repositories are already listed over here. So we want to remove the repositories like dev.glassfish.org and others, for example, and then add the repositories where Oracle patches are explicitly pushed out. That's the way we also deliver patches to our customers. So you can add those repositories specifically for Oracle GlassFish Server. And then you can add the add-on components. There are certain value adds that comes with Oracle GlassFish Server. And we talked about, for example, automatic backup and recovery. We talked about that. So that's one of them. Chris talked about JavaScript monitoring tool that comes with the value-added features. So you can install those add-on components, again, using CLI. Now, you may want to extend and update inside a closed network. So let's say that machine where you have GlassFish or the network where you have GlassFish does not have access to internet or is behind a firewall. So how do you do that? Well, we have a pre-installed toolkit image and a starter repository that is available for you. So you can download them. Then we use sneak connectivity, copy them on a USB, walk it out, and then put the USB somewhere else in that closed network and get started with that. Then you can download the repositories from support.oracle.com. They're available as a patch. You can download them and then start your local repository daemon. So the idea is all the patches, you can exactly control what patches are pushed out to your GlassFish instance this way because you control what your update center repository is effectively. And you set the publisher on each of the different GlassFish instances. You set up what your local repository is, pointing to your local repository. All right, I think the technical tips are mostly over. Now, how many of you use GlassFish documentation extensively? Well, 95% of the hand went up when you were using GlassFish. You should be using GlassFish documentation. That is your most authoritative source of documentation, other than blogs, of course. But we have very extensive set of documentations. So what I'm saying is getting started is not 4 pages. These are 4 PDF guides. Just getting started on GlassFish. So just go to glassfish.org/docs, or for Oracle GlassFish Server, you can go to that URL. By the way, all of these would be very valid for the open source version as well. So you can see getting started, installing and upgrading, administering and deploying applications. Each category has whole tons of guides that are available to you. They provide some really fine-tuning tips, all those details, nitty-gritty, what's happening under the wire, under the hood, all that is available to you. And if you want, for flights, for offline reading, you can download the entire PDF on your version, on your laptop as well. So all these guides are bundled in an easy-to-read bundle. And the best way to reach us, I would always recommend, is the forums. We have seen stack traces being posted on our Facebook wall. That's harder to debug over there. Send us stack traces in a user forum. So send us stack traces in a user forum. The GlassFish forum, which is the web interface on java.net, and the user's alias, they're mirrored with each other that way. So you can post one place and make sure that, that it's guaranteed that it's going to show up other places as well. We, of course, monitor our GlassFish Twitter handle very actively. So if you want to have a quick question, then you can always fire us a question over there. Facebook is good, but that's better for pictures and social activity instead of debugging traces. We have a very active GlassFish videos channel. We keep pushing out videos over there. And blogs.oracle.com/aquarium, which is our main property where we try to update regularly on what's happening latest in the GlassFish community. Now, because 95% of you were using GlassFish, I would really recommend there's a schedule available at the OTN Lounge where you can go and share your production story. And we give you a free copy of my latest book, which is about Java EE6 Pocket Guide. Sorry, bit commercial. But yeah, we really love to hear you, because people like you are the ones who make GlassFish successful. So you share your story, others learn from it. And tomorrow night at 6:30, we also have the GlassFish Community BOF, where we have 4 customer testimonials who are coming and talking about why they love GlassFish and how are they using GlassFish and how are they successful with GlassFish. So I hope to see you there. All right, I think that's about it. Thank you.